Every shift starts the same way, with intent and purposeful preparation. Gear double and triple checked, making sure you're ready for the day. But once you step outside, nothing about the day is guaranteed. You face the unpredictable, the weight of decisions that matter. That's why Galls stands behind the uniform, to provide the reliability and support that helps you stay ready. Supporting the hero behind the uniform. Galls is proud to serve those who serve.
New York City wasn't built in silence. Before the skyline, before organized crime, before the modern NYPD, there was 5 Points, a neighborhood born from immigration, poverty, politics, and violence.
This week, we sit down with historian and author Tyler Anbinder, one of the foremost experts on 19th century New York, to uncover the truth behind the gangs, the riots, and the draft that set the city on fire. The myths are powerful, but the history is stronger.
This is Gold Shields. So you've been a professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., famous for its public policy schools and its international schools, et cetera. And you've been a professor there for many years and researched many topics. But this is one that we want to talk to you about today. What really happened in the 19th century in New York City, and very specifically down in the Five Points district? But you developed a special interest in that, didn't you?
I did, yeah. My first book was about the anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Irish Know Nothing party that was powerful in the 1850s. And having written that book where I kind of let the Know Nothings tell their, you know, express their worldview, I felt like I owed it to the Irish immigrants to let them tell their side of the story. And I was casting around for some way to tell the Irish story, and I'm from New York, and my family was from New York, and I was at that point teaching at the University of Wyoming, and I was looking for a kind of a good excuse to get back to New York, and so I thought, "Well, I'll write about this Five Points neighborhood," which nobody in this is so you realize this is 1992, I'm thinking about this, and nobody's heard of Five Points. The neighborhood's been completely forgotten. There are no historical markers, there's no nothing, and but being a specialist in the 19th century, I knew about it, and I thought, "This would be good, I'll do this one little neighborhood, I'll write about the Irish there, and, let them tell their side of the story." But when I started, a lot of people said, "Oh, this can't be done. There's a reason there's no history of Five Points written. These people, the Irish, they were illiterate, they were poor, they left no records. The only descriptions of the neighborhood are written by the prejudiced people who came to try to reform the Irish or convert them to Protestantism and so forth." And so people said it couldn't be done, but I actually went down, started at the municipal archives there at the corner of Center Street and Chambers Street, and what? Lo and behold, there's a lot of stuff about Five Points in there that people didn't know about. Real estate records that had a lot of information, and then the police records were just a gold mine because people thought, well, the Five Pointers are getting arrested because of the prejudice of the police. But you look at the actual arrest records, and you can see the affidavits. They're still there, and you can look at the affidavits, and it's Irish immigrants, making complaints about other Irish immigrants. It's not a question of prejudiced Protestant policemen arresting Catholic Irish. It's really Irish crime upon Irish inhabitants that makes up the police records there. So there was just tons of stuff, and I ended up having a much bigger project and bigger book than I expected.
Which is a good thing. When you find more than you're expecting, I guess that's a good thing. And you kind of answered my question, how, where was your focus to get records that it was, so obscure of a story and area, and you answered that, with where you started. But my question to start is why was Five Points or that area such a draw to the immigrants coming in? Was it just that it was a little bit more developed than the rest of the island at the time? What was the draw that everyone ended up going there?
Well, it's kind of two things. So first, you know, it's really it's really hard being an immigrant. You come to this new place, you don't know anything or anybody. So one thing you want to do is you want to move to a neighborhood that's already got people from where you come from. So there's that comfort in numbers. And so 5 points was, and just so everybody knows, if because I know you guys know where it is, but 5 points is where basically Chinatown in Manhattan meets the courthouse district. So just below Canal Street and just west of the Bowery. And kind of Center Street is probably the western boundary of the neighborhood. And so that neighborhood had, for reasons we can go into if you want, had become the most Irish neighborhood in New York, in part because nobody else wanted to live there. It was considered an unhealthy neighborhood. It was built over what had been a big pond, and so it was very damp. And in those days, people didn't understand about bacteria and viruses, and they thought disease spread from kind of damp miasmas. And so nobody wanted to live in the neighborhood. And so who ends up living there? The poorest people who can't afford anything else. And that was Irish immigrants. And then when the Great Potato Famine happens in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and Irish start flooding into New York, what's the most popular place for them to go where there are the most Irish already to begin with? And so by the 1850s, there was barely an adult in 5 Points who wasn't an Irish immigrant or the child of an Irish immigrant. And so it was the most Irish place in New York, and that's why it was so popular for Irish immigrants.
So thinking back to the 1850s in New York City, people tend to think the NYPD's been in existence since the city's been in existence, but back then there were two separate police agencies, weren't there, in New York City?
Well, for a while there was. So the New York had a municipal police department that was run by the mayor. But then in the mid 1850s, and the mayor was almost always a Democrat in New York in that period. And then in the mid 1850s, the legislature, which was run by Republicans in that period, decided that the Democratic run police department wasn't doing a good enough job of enforcing certain laws, in particular the laws against having saloons open on Sunday. And so what the legislature decided to do was to disband the municipal police force and create a state-run New York City police force that whose members would be appointed by Republicans. And so I don't know how it was when you guys joined the police force. But in those days, in the 1850s, you had to have a political connection to get a job as a policeman. It was a requirement. And so, everybody knew that policemen were very much both politically active and politically connected. And so the belief was among the people up in Albany, well, if all the police are Democrats and the Democrats hate the liquor restrictions, then they're not going to enforce them. So in 1857, the legislature disbands the municipal police force and creates a state run police force. But the mayor, whose name was Fernando Wood, a Democrat, he says, I'm not going to disband this. I question the constitutionality of what you're doing. And while he was appealing it to the state's highest court, you had two competing police forces for a while there in 1857. And that was truly chaos because they competed in all sorts of ways. The state people might arrest somebody for one of the liquor laws, and then the municipal people might free them from the state people, and then vice versa some other times. Uh, and and so, yeah, you have a couple of months of chaos in New York until when in late July in 1857, the state court of appeals rules that the state law was constitutional and the municipal force was disbanded. But then the municipal force leaders realized they couldn't really police the city well without the experience of the older veteran police. And so eventually they start hiring those policemen back, and you end up with the police force you have today, really.
Kind of a merger.
Kind
Uh,
of a merger, exactly.
that went on. That's so fascinating. You're looking at two guys who spent 50 years in the NYPD, and I didn't know that history. I've never heard that. It's fascinating to hear the development and how immigration formed kind of the NYPD.
What you might find most, uh, interesting or funny about it is the climax of all this came when the 2 police forces went to City Hall one day, and, uh, a riot starts between the 2 police forces on the steps of City Hall. And today, the way City Hall is, there aren't really steps leading up to it, though. Well, there's a couple of steps, but imagine on those steps where mayors have press conferences every day, you have these 2 police forces battling it out with their billy clubs and whatnot, and, it was some sight.
If I remember that correctly from my reading of history, that was in an event where the Republican-led police agency was trying to arrest the mayor, and
Exactly.
they tried to storm City Hall. The Democrats came. It became an enormous fight, and both sides sort of at some point, it ended, and the mayor did not get arrested.
Right, they wanted to arrest the mayor for not disbanding his police force, and yes, that's very good. Yeah, you know the details. Impressive.
I learned how to read last week. I've been flexing. Two police forces, political corruption, riots on the steps of City Hall, but beyond the chaos of power, 5 points was something even more dangerous. It was poverty, concentrated, ignored, and growing in the shadows of a city still under construction. Well, let's move into the gang situation in New York City at this time, which was a big problem. Gangs are not a new thing, but there were a bunch of gangs in New York City at the time and in and around the 5 Points area. Who were they? And tell us a little bit about them if you can.
Well, here I may disappoint you a little, Dan. The term gangs as it was used in the 1840s and 50s is different, means something different than what we think of it as today. So you don't in the pre-Civil War period have what you would call kind of organized criminal gangs per se. So the press uses the term gangs a lot, but that could refer, say, so there's a again in 1857, there's another riot, and this takes place in 5 Points between two rival quote unquote gangs. One's known in the press as the Dead Rabbits, and the other is known as the Bowery Boy. But when you look into it, as I did in my 5 Points book, what you find is these aren't like two criminal gangs. Um, the term was used by the press to describe the guys who hung out at this one bar on Mulberry Street. And, these were all people who had day jobs who they were not they were not criminals. The only quote unquote criminal thing they did was to fight the Bowery Boys who came and impinged on their territory. And so when this term gangs is used in the 1840s and 50s, it doesn't mean the same thing that we think of in the post-Civil War period, where these are people where you're talking about people who make a living through crime. Um, and I don't even and that's even including, we're not talking about occupations that are like a cover for the criminal activity. So when the press talks about gangs, it's not really the same thing that we're talking about later on. And so that's one thing in the gangs Gangs of New York movie that Scorsese really gets wrong, because he's just reading the old newspaper accounts and he's using the modern description of gangs in his head. And, that movie is called Gangs of New York because it's based on this book that was written in the 1920s, in the heyday of organized crime, right, with prohibition and everything. And so writing in the 1920s, Herbert Asbury reads back to the old newspapers and he says, "Oh, look, there are all these all this organized crime like we have today with bootlegging." And he assumes it's the same thing, but it's really not. Do you have criminals in this period? Of course you do. And do they sometimes work together? Yes. But um but the way the movie depicts it is far-fetched, let's put it that way. And I told Scorsese that, and he's like, "Yeah, I know, but it makes a much better film if we make it like this, because everybody today thinks of, organized crime." And he said, "I kinda see this movie as a prequel to Goodfellas. It's kind of the origins of Italian organized crime. And so I want there to be this cinematic lead into what you have later on. And it doesn't matter, he said, if it's, if they weren't really organized in the same way the Italians were later on.
Looking for powerful defense without the mess? Meet Impact, a revolutionary line of chemical irritants designed for law enforcement, military, and personal protection. With no blowback, no cross-contamination, and easy cleanup, Carry Impact delivers unmatched stopping power without the hassle. Whether you're in the field or on the street, safety should never be compromised. Protect yourself with the next generation of defense. Carry Impact, stopping power, redefined.
When it comes to the safety of law enforcement, first responders, and military personnel, every moment counts, especially in the dark. Streamlight provides the reliable, high-performance lighting solutions that these heroes trust in the most dangerous situations, whether it's a car stop, navigating dark alleyways, or exploring abandoned buildings. With Streamlight by their side, our heroes can tackle challenges with confidence, knowing they have the power of advanced lighting technology to guide them. From the first responders on the front lines to the law enforcement officers ensuring our safety, Streamlight is there to make every mission a little easier and much safer. Join us in supporting those who protect us. Visit Streamlight.com to discover how you can be part of the team keeping our heroes safe. Because when they shine, we all shine.
The legend of 5 Points was sharpened by newspapers, and later by Hollywood. But the real violence wasn't cinematic. It was overcrowded streets, collapsing buildings, and a neighborhood struggling under poverty and political control. At what point, Tyler, did that area just become this overwhelming, historical, dangerous, populated dirt? Like, was there a point in time that it just switched from, okay, there's immigrants going there, there's saloons, there's this and that, to this overwhelming piece of land that became really dangerous?
So it happens almost as soon as they lay the neighborhood out. So they lay the neighborhood out in the very end of the 18 teens and early 1820s. They start building there. They fill in the pond. And the reason Center Street is called Center Street is because they lay it out across the center of the pond. And this was a big feature of Manhattan. People every winter they'd go ice skating on the pond, and the pond had a big, kind of a huge hill next to it, and so people would go in during summer, picnic on the hill and look out over the pond, and then the winter they'd climb the hill also and watch the skaters out there, and you had a view from the hill all the way south almost to the Battery, so it was a very popular place to go. But they cover it up. They take the hill, they use the hill to fill in the lake, and they start building housing there. It's just then like today, developers have a lot of political power and they say, we want to build. And so they build. But as soon as they start building, and they're mostly building at this point, 2 to 3 story frame houses. And almost as soon as they start building them, they start to sink and sway. And because of, the lake was the source of the water in the lake came from below. And so the water keeps, you know, bubbling up, even though they fill it in. And so people are afraid to live in these houses. They start tilting right away. And so nobody who has any money is going to live in them. And so the people who own them decide, well, rather than live here myself, I'm going to subdivide this into apartments and rent it to all these immigrants who are coming into the city, right? Because by the 1830s, you've got more Irish immigrants coming than immigrants from any other place. And so the Irish immigrants are poorer than any immigrants who have ever come to America at this point. And so the Irish immigrants start living there. And it's also a good place for them to live because it's central, right? So usually poor immigrants had lived on the periphery of cities because that was where the rent was cheapest. But because of this weird oddity of this filled in lake with the water coming up from below, you have a place that's very central and yet it's very cheap. And so it's an easy walk, right? Because this is before subways and stuff. And the poor immigrants aren't going to pay money to ride one of these horse-drawn omnibuses. And so instead, you want to walk to work. So if you live in Five Points, you're just 2 blocks from Broadway. You're close to everything, and especially all the construction jobs, which is mostly what the Irish are doing. And so So that's why it becomes very popular. And then, as is the case in most of the United States and maybe most of the world, for all I know, where you have poverty, you tend to also have crime, and so it the two quickly go together. And as a result, already by the late 1820s, so we're just talking a couple years after they've built the place, already Five Points is infamous as the poorest place in New York and really the most impoverished neighborhood in America. And the reason it becomes so, a tourist attraction really already by the late 1820s is because, Americans are very proud of the fact that they really don't have poverty like Europe has. Because there's so much upward mobility. There's such a constant shortage of labor in America, right? Because, remember, if we're talking the 1820s, the Western frontier is Ohio. And so there's plenty of places you can move if you can't get if you're a shoemaker in New York and there are too many shoemakers and you're not earning very much money, you move to Ohio and you're going to make a lot of money as a shoemaker because you have no competition. And so as a result, Americans had unprecedented upward mobility. And so to see a place like Five Points where people were so poor and lived in such, wretched conditions, Americans say, "Can this really be true? I gotta go see this." And so you would go there, you would find a policeman. You guys would find this interesting. You could hire a policeman to give you an escorted tour. You'd pay the policeman, and they would guide you through the neighborhood and protect you. And that was a way you would earn extra money. Um,
That's fascinating.
Another thing you guys would find interesting, as since you were detectives, is this is another thing I read about in the records in Five Points. If you got robbed, if even if you lived in Five Points, so you didn't have to be particularly wealthy. You got robbed in Five Points. Apparently, the the police would say, "Yeah, it's too bad. We're never going to find them." And so a lot of people would then you would hire the detective to, in their off hours, go search for your stolen goods. And a lot of people got their goods back by hiring New York City policemen, in their off hours to go do the detective work. So I thought that was interesting. You
That
don't
is
seem to
interesting.
have in that period in the 1840s and 50s, and here I'm no expert. Um, you don't seem to have people called detectives per se in the police force. They tend to go hire like office, not the patrolman, but like a sergeant or a captain, and that's the person you hire to go find your goods. But you may know, maybe there are detectives. I'm not sure.
That's a good question. I don't know going back that far. So you mentioned earlier about having to be politically connected in order to get a job as a policeman.
Yeah.
Now, you have to wonder why, of course, right? Because why would I have to use political contacts to get a civil service job? Um, let's be honest, they made money. There was a lot of opportunity for policemen to make money, not just this way, but in other ways too. If you're allowing a bar to be open on a Sunday in violation of the law, if you don't think that you're getting something for it, you're crazy. That's just the way it works. So there was a lot of that going on too. Crazy times, crazy times. But um, in looking back at all this time, there were some very famous fights, and I think Martin Scorsese did his best to portray mass fighting in the street with hatchets and people getting killed. And some people were killed, but there were some very famous fights. And probably the most famous one was in 1863, the draft riots. But before then, what were some of the ones that stood out to you in terms of just scale of people in the street fighting down in Five Points?
Sure. Um, yeah, what you have, I guess the term I would use rather than fights would be riots, which is the kind of thing, the three of us here are kind of older. Rioting is kind of a bygone thing for the most part. But back when we were young and before that, riots, you had riots. Probably every year, someplace you had a riot. And so rioting was what you had in New York in that period. And that would be where, a large crowds would gather and go on a rampage over a specific issue. Um, and so in Five Points, the most famous riots you had would generally take place over a couple of issues. So one would be abolitionism, right? So starting in the 1830s, the abolitionist movement to end slavery in the United States starts getting bigger and bigger. Um, Irish immigrants, for reasons we could go into if you want, tended to be against the abolition movement. And so what you have in Five Points is in the 1830s, you have a big anti-abolition riot where, hundreds of people gather in Five Points. It's often with these riots, not always clear exactly how the mob starts. And then they go rampaging around Five Points and vicinity, wrecking the homes or businesses of people who were known leaders of the abolition movement in New York. And so that's one kind of riot you would have in Five Points. Another riot you would have in Five Points, though, would be an anti-immigrant riot. And so in a case like that, you have one of those in the 1830s too, where a mob from outside the neighborhood comes to Five Points and says, "We've got too many immigrants here. We've got to put them in their place." And they rampage through Five Points, attacking the Catholic Church there and things like that. And then the other kind of riot you have, which is actually the most common, would be what I'd call political riots, which would be, say, one faction of the Democratic Party fighting against another, or Democrats fighting against non-Democrats, which in the 1830s and 40s is going to be Whigs, in the 1850s and later would be Republicans. And these are the most common in part because elections in those days were a very violent, dangerous kind of process. And so what you would have in New York City, we're old enough to remember to know, and I guess in New York it's still the case where you have the polling places, say, in a school, right, or some other location like that. But back in the 19th century, polling places were in typically saloons, and they were in saloons in part because the politicians knew that if you had the polling place in your saloon, a lot more beer and whiskey on that day, and so it was kind of a little prize to one of your supporters. "All right, I'm gonna put the polling place in your saloon this year. You're gonna make a lot of money, but then you expect some of that money to come back in the form of contributions to, say, the alderman's campaign. And then furthermore, so once it's in a saloon, that means the people who are of the political stripe of that saloon keeper are going to feel comfortable there, and the people who aren't will not. And because in Irish neighborhoods the Democrats were so dominant, you end up with factions within the Democratic Party. The people who are allies of the saloon keeper at the corner of Mulberry and, say, Canal Street, but then there's another saloon keeper at the corner of Bayard and Mulberry, and he wants to be the next alderman. And so each of them will get their kind of hired strongmen, their guys who are good with their fists, and they'll go to the polling place and they'll try to intimidate the other factions people out of voting. So and in those days when you voted, you didn't just go into a booth and mark who you wanted to vote for. You actually had to go in with a piece of paper that listed the people you wanted to vote for. And you took this piece of paper and you put it into a glass bowl, and that was how you voted. And so what would happen would be these tough guys would hang out at the polling place and they demand to see your ballot before they'd let you in. And if they didn't like your ballot, they'd throw you out. And that was a way that the politicians tried to suppress the vote of their opponents and help the vote of their sympathizers. And then sometimes when the guys who were, the guy whose voters were being kicked out, wanted to get elected, what would he do? He'd hire more, if you've got 10 guys in the vote, go hire 20 and come and kick your 10 out. And then the 10 who get kicked out go get 20 more. Now they have 30. And you end up with full-fledged riots sometimes as a result of that. And you see that in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. So I found especially amusing when I was doing research on the Five Points book, looking at a New York Times headline from the late 1850s, and it said, "Quiet election yesterday, only 2 people killed." And that was considered a quiet election in 1850s New York. That's kind of the end of that. It became, and so what happens is that kind of gets so out of hand that people like Boss Tweed come up with a better solution. And so what Boss Tweed says is all this fighting, it's embarrassing. Instead, so what Boss Tweed started doing was first he hired people to vote multiple times. So he'd say, all right, I want you to go vote in 5 Points. I want you to go vote in, Hell's Kitchen. And he hired people to vote in all these different places and rig the vote that way. And then when they came up with voter registration in order to fight that, what they came up with next was simply Boss Tweed said, all right, well, I'll just bribe the people who are quote unquote counting the votes and make up the vote results. And that became the heyday of the Tweed ring.
Patriot is a premium whiskey hard seltzer. We've carefully crafted 4 flavors that not only taste exceptional, but can be enjoyed on any occasion, anytime. We're committed to giving back 5% of all profits to the core groups we call the backbone of America. We are proud to help those who serve our great country. This is America's Seltzer, the brand that stands for quality, community, and the American spirit.
This isn't just coffee. It's a story in your cup. Bone Frog Coffee Company was born from a tribute to the U.S. Navy SEAL Brotherhood, honoring the courage, sacrifice, and relentless drive of the men who serve. And at the heart of it all is Bone Frog Blend, a medium roast crafted from organically grown beans from Indonesia, Central and South America, with rich notes of chocolate, citrus, and a smooth finish you'll savor every morning. When you brew Bone Frog, you're not just fueling your day, you're supporting veteran-owned business and the families of those who gave their all. Bone Frog, coffee that tells a story.
For 4 days, New York turned on itself. Not over territory, not over pride,
But over fear, over politics, over who belonged in the future of the country.
the city survived, but it was never the same.
So in 1863, well, to be exact, in 1862, Congress passes a law that says each congressional district has to supply a certain number of soldiers to the war effort, for the Civil War. And if those districts don't meet their quotas, then they have to have a draft to send more men to meet their district quota. And so New Yorkers said, well, look, the quota is the same for each congressional district, but in New York City, our congressional districts are full of immigrants who aren't citizens, and citizens aren't eligible to be drafted. So they said our quota should be smaller in New York because we don't have as many draft eligible people. But the Lincoln administration said, no, that would be too complicated. Each district has to have the same number of people serve in the Civil War. And so New Yorkers were very unhappy as a result when the draft comes in July of 1863. And so when the draft is started, and the way it worked is they would, in each congressional district in the city, they would have this meeting, and everybody who was eligible for the draft had to go in and give their name and their address and their occupation and so forth. And everyone was assigned a number. And then they had these big wheels, like they, I don't know if they still use them today, like with the lotto and with the numbers spinning around. And they would either put a guy with a blindfold, or sometimes they would find a blind resident of the neighborhood who would reach into the thing and pull out numbers. And then they'd look at the logbook and they say, all right, number 63, that's Dan Murphy. Dan, you have to come report. And that didn't mean you were necessarily in the war at that point, because you could go in and say, I'm an Irish immigrant. I've never become a citizen. Therefore, I'm ineligible. And they say, okay, that's fine. Next person. And so in Irish neighborhoods, almost nobody who was drafted actually ended up serving in New York, because in those days, the federal government didn't keep lists of all the people who had been naturalized. And so even though you might have gotten naturalized because you wanted to vote, the government had no proof that you had become a citizen. And so you could say, sorry, I'm not a citizen. And there was no way they could prove otherwise, unless they could find some witness and say, hey, I saw Dan vote at the last election, so he must be a citizen. So as a result, hardly any New Yorkers are forced to serve as a result of the draft, because especially immigrants, because they can get out of it one way or another, or or they failed the physical, or there were all sorts of reasons. Um, but a few did, and that created enough resentment that when they have the draft, um, Democratic New Yorkers, and in particular, and that's mostly Irish immigrants at that point, um, start a riot, and they first go and destroy the places where the draft is being held. This is up in what's now Midtown Manhattan, then was kind of the northern periphery of settled Manhattan. Um, and once they destroy the draft office, they're like, all right, let's go find some Republicans and attack their homes. And so the mob will go and attack the homes of well-known Republicans. The other big targets are Black New Yorkers. So woe to an African American who was found on the street during the draft riots, because they would get dragged away and beaten or lynched. And so most of the deaths in the draft riots are of African Americans who are killed by rioters. Um, and eventually it took, and so the rioters were kind of going, and the riots spread throughout the city. Pretty much, the police were completely overwhelmed by it, as you can imagine, because you're talking in this riot, thousands and thousands of people in the streets. And the city police department was tiny in comparison. And so eventually you have troops brought into the city, and the troops line up on big thoroughfares like, First Avenue, Second Avenue, and they eventually bring artillery, um, and they disperse the rioters that way. And that's the only way that that order is brought back to the city. And so you have, over 100 people killed in the draft riots, um, African Americans, and then Irish Americans who were killed by often actually Irish American soldiers who are quelling the riots in New York.
The riots were real. The fear was real. The blood in the streets was real.
But history doesn't live forever in archives. It lives in stories and sometimes in film.
Dan had mentioned before, and you did as well, the movie Gangs of New York, and you mentioned conversation you had with Martin Scorsese when he was putting it together. I want to ask you, what in the movie did he get right? What do you look at and go, yeah, okay, that happened? Was it a character like, Bill the Butcher? Was that real, or any of the other points that took place? And what did the movie actually nail, in your opinion?
Okay. All right. This is going to take a minute or two. Oh,
We're good
let
at
me
that.
let me describe. Let me describe. So I was a consultant on the movie. So in some ways, I suppose you could blame me for the things that are wrong. Although I'll describe why you can't really. So what Scorsese did is he sent me the screenplay, and he said, "I want you to go." His minions said, "Scorsese wants you to go through this with a fine tooth comb, point out everything that's wrong, and then come meet with him and tell him." So they send me the screenplay. I go through it, and I am not, and so the way the screenplay works is each page is about a minute of movie. And at this point, I read it's about 150 pages. So they ended up cutting down the movie shorter than that in the end. But I read the 150 pages, and there's something wrong on every single page. So at first I go to New York, and at first they say, well, you're going to meet with Marty later. He's actually meeting right now with Leonardo DiCaprio. So instead, right now, we want you to meet with the whole team. And so I go into this big room, and there's like 20 people, and everybody has a pad. This is the 1990s still. So they have a pad and a piece and a pen, and they're writing all this stuff down. And they say, all right, go through every page and tell us what's wrong. And so I go through every page, and I say, okay, you've got, on this page, you've got you've got Chinese prostitutes in 5 points, and there were no Chinese prostitutes in 5 points in the 1850s. They're like, okay, yeah, and they write that down. And I go to the next page, and all right, you have this incident happening here in the 1850s, but that didn't actually happen until the 1880s. And I'm like, okay, I write that down. And we do this for an hour, And then they say, okay, now we want you to go tell all these things to Marty. And so they bring me in this other room, and I see Leonardo DiCaprio is walking out the door in one side of the room when I'm walking in the other side of the room. That was the closest I got to a movie star in the whole process. And so I start telling Scorsese these things, and whereas the other people just wrote these down, Scorsese had an answer for every one of these things. And if you know anything about the film, this was like his passion project. He'd worked on this for a quarter century before it actually got made. So this was his like baby. And so he knew every word of every page of the screenplay. So I'd go to that thing about the no Chinese prostitute in that page. He said, yeah, I know that, but eventually the neighborhood became Chinatown, and I want to have a little nod to that. And there's a period where when the Chinese come, the Irish are still there. And so I want there to be that acknowledgement that there was this, melting pot character to the neighborhood, even if it didn't start with the Chinese in that period, it is a melting pot. And so I think that's valid. I'm like, sure. Okay. And so he has, answers like this. And then some of them he'll get to, I get to one and he says, well, that scene has to be like that because that scene is an homage to a scene in the 1926 film Battleship Potemkin. And it's really important in my filmmaking that I pay tribute to my directorial heirs and the people who influenced me. And that's why that scene has to be that way. I know it's wrong, but I'm doing it because it's a way I can copy this scene from this other movie. Okay. Then I go to the next one. And I say, well, this one is totally wrong, right? Because this you're taking things that happened 3 decades apart and putting them together. It's like, yeah, I know that one is wrong, but that scene appeared to me in a dream. And my dreams are really important to me as a kind of artistic vision. And so when I have a really memorable dream about a project I'm working on, I try to incorporate the dream into the film because I want that part of my subconscious to come out in my filmmaking. Okay, can't argue with that. Um, this last one, I promise I'll stop now. But this last part gets to your question about what's right and what's wrong. So then there's a scene where I know if you're so for people who haven't seen the movie, the movie basically has Daniel Day-Lewis, who is this anti-immigrant nativist, Bill the Butcher, and then the Leonardo DiCaprio figure is the son of an Irish priest. We don't have to get into why the priest has a son, but it is. And he's the leader of the Irish in the neighborhood. Daniel Day-Lewis is the leader of the nativists who don't want to give political power to the Irish. And so each of them is running a candidate for sheriff of New York. And the scene climaxes with the voters going to the polls, and Leonardo DiCaprio like drags every drunk and bum out of the neighborhood to the polls to vote for the Irish candidate for sheriff. And in the scene, it says in the screenplay, one of the drunks is led by DiCaprio into the voting booth, the curtains close, and then the drunk and DiCaprio puts the pencil in his hand and ticks the box on the ballot that has the name of the Irish candidate for sheriff. So I said, all right. I said, you didn't vote that way in the 19th century. You brought your ballot into the polling place. You didn't go into a booth. There was no curtain. You put the piece of paper into a glass vault, and that was how you voted. So out of all my 3 hours I spent with him, this is the only time he doesn't have an excuse like before. He says, aha, that I can change. And he turns to the minions who are behind him and he says, change that scene. Right? So that's the only thing of 150 things I said. That's the only thing that was wrong that he said he was going to change. But then the movie, 3 years later, the movie comes out because then they go and film it. And then it's delayed because of 9/11. And then it finally comes out. So I go to see the movie and here it's, coming before my eyes, all the stuff I had written, the screenplay. And, he kept in the homage, he kept in the dream, he kept in all that stuff. So it finally gets to the voting booth. And I think, aha, the one thing I influenced in this movie is finally going to be here. Did he change it? No.
Nope.
The guy still goes into a booth. There's still a curtain. There's still a pencil ticking off a box on a ballot. So,
Oh,
so,
great.
so, so to answer your question, Dan, In terms of the minute historical facts, everything is wrong. There was a Bill the Butcher, he did exist. There was a big election for sheriff in 1857 where there was an Irish and a non-Irish candidate that was a big deal. Um, Other than that, pretty much all the details are wrong, except here's the thing. Um, the overall theme of the movie, which is that the Irish had to literally fight, physically fight for their rights in America to wrest those rights away from native born Americans who didn't want to give the Irish their due. That's completely true. And that's the theme the movie portrays. And so the details of the plot are not good, but the theme of the movie is completely accurate. And so if you come away from the movie saying, "Huh, I didn't realize the Irish really had to fight to get accepted in America," then you've come away with the right message. If you say, "Oh, there was that brothel there and it looked and the old brewery looked like this and tenements looked like that," that would be wrong. The other thing though that they get exactly right are the clothes. The clothes, like they went and found old clothes and they made clothes with the same material as clothes were made back then. So the clothes are amazing. The streets, so anything you see outside is right. They took old photographs and they built a s- you know a sets that looked exactly like the streets looked, but everything that's inside is wrong. All the little historical details of each incident are wrong, but the theme is right. And so I saw Scorsese talk about this, and he said, I hate that people come to my movies and expect historical accuracy. He said, because that's not, he said, you should no more expect historical accuracy from one of my films than you should expect historical accuracy from an opera. He said, I have a goal, which is to have the viewer leave having been emotionally touched and left learning a message. And as long as they learn that message and are emotionally touched, all the details I use to get to that don't have to be factually accurate. And I think with this movie, he achieves those things. But people expect that every detail is accurate. But if it weren't for those inaccuracies, I wouldn't be here talking to you guys probably.
And thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. What a great visit. I could sit and listen to you talk for hours and hours about you just a wealth of information about this. And you have other books and works and things going on. And how can people find out more about you and your work and just let our audience know?
Well, there's a couple of things you can do. My books are easy to find. They're all on Amazon and especially if you're in New York at local bookstores. But so if you want to learn more about the 5 Points neighborhood, my book is called 5 Points and it's easily available in paperback and so forth. And that's, any place that Amazon has it, any place that sells books has it.
What a pleasure. I mean, real pleasure to have you on. We love doing shows like this because we do so many that are tough to do and hard subjects and really involved. And when we have an opportunity to do a show like this, it's so much fun and something, historical thing we can give back to everyone listening and watching and everything. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You're welcome. It's been my pleasure.
And Dan, this is the part of the show we just say a small prayer for our law enforcement officers and our military vets and make sure everyone just keeps them in mind, remember them and what they do and the sacrifices they lay out there every single day. And they all do it voluntarily and they really don't want much in return. So we can all just give them a prayer and the respect for what they do and their families because their families go through it just as much. So thank you for that. For my partner, Dan Murphy, for an incredible, absolute pleasure to have Tyler Anbinder on. Thank you, everyone. Everyone stay safe out there, and we'll see everybody soon.